Take a look at this map of Colombia, and now look at this map. You see something strange, a little off? If we overlay them, you'll notice most of Colombia's 51 million people live in the mountainous Andes, almost 3 kilometers above sea level. That is not common, especially when they have access to a lot of flat coastal land. For contrast, most major cities are around 250 meters or less above sea level, and about 50% of the world's population live near the coast. So, why this? The answer is heat, at least in part. The lowlands are incredibly hot, bringing diseases like dengue, Zika, and malaria, meaning most of Colombia's population is safely out of reach. And while the flatland here is a great environment for tropical jungle, the people there found it easier to expand into the much cooler flatlands and valleys throughout the mountains. It's no secret our environment impacts where and how we live, so when we're world building, we often do this exact same thing. And I talk about world building a lot like this because I've got books on it, and I want to thank the tens of thousands of people who have already bought this all across the world because look at this. You guys voted for this, you picked the cover, and this is the cover art for On Writing and Word Building Volume 3. It's stunning, I listened to what you guys wanted, the people who wanted the obelisk were loud and clear, and I made it work for you. It's coming November 23rd, note that down in your calendar. These books cover all of the writing and word building discussions we've had on the channel, plus tons of extra notes and analysis. They're all entirely separate, you can buy whichever ones you want, but I'm so excited for Volume 3. Link below. Go get them now. And after you've done that, I want to ask you something. How often does your world building look like this? You'll draw up a landmass, sprinkle in some mountains, then figure out where the rivers go, and oh, there's a natural spot for a city, flatlands, water, and the ocean for trade. And well, you think to yourself, with all these mountains around, they probably worship gods up on a mountain, right? And the ranges naturally are bordered with other nations, of course, and these people probably use phrases like, a man is only as big as the mountain he can climb. So we'll call the city, say, the Reach, for how far away it is. This sounds pretty good and natural, right? This is a kind of hard world building, immersing readers through realistic detail. And the first go-to is often looking at the environment and drawing cultural and geopolitical elements out of that. We see it in Dune, in The Lord of the Rings, in Game of Thrones, in the Stormlight Archives, The Expanse, Tamora Pierce's work, Naomi Novik's, but don't fall into the trap of environmental determinism. This is the idea that a civilization's success, culture, religion, politics are mostly defined by their environment, when that's just not the case. Culture, politics, language, and society is equally defined by the threats we face, the wars we fight, religious movements, class systems, nearby cultural influences, things brought over with trade, technology, and very importantly, migration and colonialism, all of which can completely override whichever environmental pressures or barriers there might be. After all, has humanity not spent thousands of years trying to eliminate the environmental pressures that would normally shape us? We're not just the top of the food chain, we're barely even part of it, and yet our culture keeps evolving. And this is especially the case in a world of increasing globalization. The environment around us is less important than ever to the types of food we eat, the clothes we wear, the music we listen to, the languages we speak, the phrases we use, the religions we follow, the symbolism in our architecture. It's no wonder a core world-building feature of science fiction is how culturally diverse and separated from the environment people often are. When you world build like this, starting with the map, too often the world becomes a snapshot of the modern world that you have created, and especially the environment that you've started with. We look at our map and design people and places based on the forces at play at the time of our story, when they kind of ignores the historical context that the world is built atop of that is arguably far more important, especially because social structures, traditions, economic priorities, and symbolism will carry over from past social pressures which may no longer apply. China doesn't just associate the color red with prosperity because, say, a rare flower in the region made the color, but because it was long the color of the emperor. There's that structural system there, even though the last Chinese emperor abdicated in 1912, and it was rebranded again with new meaning in the Communist Revolution. And yet, those influences carry over. So don't just think about how the world is, but think about how people used to die, the struggles they used to face, the solutions they used to have to come up with, the influences they were once under. There's this really interesting detail in The Legend of Korra, where Republic City is this modern, multicultural hub of the world in a relatively temperate region, and yet it's still customary of young people with Water Tribe heritage to do this coming-of-age challenge where they have to navigate a boat through difficult waters. borders. If you're living in Republic City, you don't need to do this sort of thing anymore, but it's reminiscent of that heritage, navigating icebergs in the Arctic or Antarctic. Those social values and rituals persist, or perhaps a religion swept through the region centuries ago and has since died out. No one really sticks to it, but we still see the religious symbols in the architecture. The verses from their text might still be relevant. You're not just looking at the world as it is, but as the world has been, and this applies to the environment too. Rivers change where they go, climates get hotter and colder, resources might get depleted, continents may shift. Because you gotta remember, even if the pressures that gave rise to this stuff aren't there anymore, that part of the culture can adapt and evolve. And let me tell you about the Cooper's Hill Cheese Rolling Wake. It's an annual event in Gloucester, England, where participants chase a wheel of cheese down a hill. Now, exactly how this started is unclear, but it might have been something to do with who got grazing rights on a common area, or perhaps a pagan ritual from pre-Christian England that involved scattering buns and fruits down the hill to symbolize fertility or a good harvest. Whatever its origins, it looks nothing like however it started out, but that cultural element evolved and adapted. It continued on in some form. Even though it doesn't look like it has anything to do with the environment anymore, it survived. Starting with this sort of map wouldn't tell you a lot of this stuff, and that active and passive choice for how cultural elements evolve and what survives is arguably even more important than whatever it meant in the first place. And that's determined by way more factors than the environment. New economic and social pressures are going to alter what came before, and they're going to adapt to a new sociological climate. Weddings and Christmas and Easter are just packed full of cultural details like this. We keep pieces of the past and discard others all the time. And with this, you can create a fascinating tapestry of wibbly-wobbly old and new influences, contradictions, and long-dead traditions that people no longer fully understand. I know that it feels intuitively wrong to create parts of your world that people don't understand, or that maybe you don't understand, but a lot of our world is kind of like this. This sort of disconnect can make a society and world feel lived in, like it's had time, especially because for most of our history, there's been no records, or very few of them. The world rarely gives us a one-to-one cause to consequence, right? And I think that's what people often do when they draw cultural elements out of the environment. And the most glaring example of why environmental determinism is such a big trap for hard world building is probably colonization and migration, which are often far more influential in how a civilization evolves than their environment. Colonization exports cultural and religious practices, political institutions, food, and whole languages around the world, which brings with it sayings, literature, terminology, all of which often have very little to do with the environment they find themselves in, and may even work against it. Again, the environment is a factor in all of this, but English is the language of power in our world, less because England had a favourable geography than because it chose to colonize so much of the world, and especially ended up founding the United States, which emerged as a superpower following World War II. And when we look at post-colonial countries, we can often see that heritage more vividly than we do the original culture that developed there. And likewise, migration is another big one. When people migrate, they bring with them their traditions, their languages, their sayings, their beliefs, their practices, their agriculture, wherever they go, even if they change and adapt to this new environment. That city of people next to the mountains might live there now, but maybe a huge part of their population originally came from a desert, so they have a water ceremony each winter to show how valuable it is to them. A migrating population will bring with it practices which may not have any inherent social value in this environment, but it's still something socially valuable for them. Again, these things flex and adapt, and what survives and what doesn't is an even more fascinating world-building question to me. If you start by just looking at your map and the environment and figuring out what you can take from it, it can make the world feel a little bit static, like it evolved once and then never changed. Middle-earth and Westeros are both praised for their realistic world-building, but I can't help but notice the environmental determinism at play there too. Like, the dwarves live in mountains, and so they love mining, and were typically stoneworkers and smiths, and just like stone, they're stubborn and immovable, and their religion is centered around stones and mines and mountains. All their sayings and architecture relies on that kind of imagery too. There's a similar problem with the Ironborns, who are basically Vikings, right? They're supposedly living on the stormy, inhospitable Iron Islands, and it means their religion is all about how life is suffering and hard, so they raid along the coast for plunder and women. And the Vikings did do that. There were those environmental pressures, but they also looked to settle and farm new lands, as they did in France and England. The Ironborn seem static in comparison, having little interest in this, and can be a little cartoonish if you look at it one way. Like, we see these environmental influences, but not the way these cultures change. In this sense, it's often to think about world building in terms of influences in a place than what's immediately around them on the map. Influences in the past, the present, changing solutions, and things that will overcome geographical barriers. The scholarly discussion around environmental determinism suggests that the environment does play a role, but it becomes less and less important the more civilization develops. Good resources, good weather, good land will often determine where civilization thrives really early on, but it gets way less predictable the further and further we get. So maybe let the environment decide who becomes an empire, who colonizes. Like, England had a lot of coal and good farmland, but think of it in terms of which people are going to have more influence. And built into this is a lot of sort of assumptions that we just make when world building, like mountain ranges should be borders, right? Because we look at a map of Europe and go, yeah, that makes sense. So we get Dawn and Westeros being separated by the Red Mountains. But here's the thing, it's not even always true, even when we're looking at Europe. Take a look at this map of Romania. What do you see? It's divided in two by the Carpathian Mountains, but a long history of cultural and political unity, a shared language, similar traditions, and the climate of European unification, nationalism in the late 19th century saw Romania overcome any barriers that these mountains posed. It's not a border, and hey, let's not even get started on the right angle lines or the crooked jigsaw puzzle lines of colonization where they're trying to figure out where the different ethnic groups belong. Famously, Pakistan and India just get along great. Colonization often creates distinct and very unnatural divisions within a region, such that when independence comes, those divisions are actually more important to where the borders fall than whatever natural borders there might be, or any ethnic, groups there might be within the region that would otherwise decide. Mountains aren't always borders, rivers can change where they go, and think back to that map of Colombia. People don't always live on the flatlands near the coast. So if you start with the environment as your first port of call when creating a religion, a culture, political system, think about the assumptions you're building into your world. What are you privileging in this given society, and are you possibly limiting yourself? But of course, don't forget the environment. Frank Herbert famously spent years studying the desert and ecology for Dune, In his books, the desert-dwelling Fremen are constantly on the verge of running out of water, so they develop these suits which recycle their bodily fluids, even urine, almost perfectly. And spitting before someone is a sign of respect. You're giving up water for them. And that stuff can be really cool and mind-blowing, and if you see this conscious effort of the writer to make it so that their world makes sense, I like seeing that. I think that's really interesting, and I can tell someone's thought about the world they're creating. Hard world building is extremely popular these days with authors like Brandon Sanderson, who does that a lot. I personally prefer kind of soft world building type stuff, where things are focused a bit more on theme and experiential consistency, but both of them have their flaws. And if you want to learn more, I can wholeheartedly recommend getting On Writing and World Building Volume 2. It's got a whole bunch of more stuff talking about hard world building and soft world building, and I think you would really like it. There are links down below. You can go get that. And remember, Volume 3, November 23rd this year, this gorgeous cover. I'm so excited. You can have the best of both worlds. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.